Brian, if you go shopping for a camera now, how different are your expectations to 10 years ago?
Well, I think actually if you look at price for what you're getting, if you're looking at the price of what's happened with full frame, it used to be, there was a time when full frame cameras, you were in the $5,000 to $8,000 range, and now to bring them in the range of $1,500 and less, I think it's made it a price point that actually is a lot easier for people to step into and be able to have the same type of image quality that used to cost a fortune. I think one of the other things that's exciting about this is for people who've had legacy glass that's not been supported any other way, whether it's old contacts glass or like our lenses that there's not bodies for currently. I had an old Minolta 58 millimeter 1.2, and for about $50 I've got an adapter that I can use. So that's kind of the trade-off now, is with mirrorless being able to support legacy lenses and being able to shoot with stuff you may have had in your closet and wanted to find a use for. It mitigates a lot of those costs because you're able to use glass that's maybe sitting around, or you can buy at bargain prices today.
I mean, Justin, we talked about the lens range for the X series. You say 19 lenses, I think, including the ones on the roadmap. I mean, how important was what Brian just talked about? How important is people using non-Fujifilm lenses, legacy, odd, third-party, old? Did you factor that in?
To me, it's one of those things that it makes the adaptation of a new camera system much easier from anyone's price point. If you already maybe have a couple lenses sitting around, especially someone like us starting on a completely new lens line. The original X Pro came out with 3 lenses. So you had a choice of an 18, a 35, and a 60 macro. You're very limited as to what you have for choices, but having a very short flange to focus distance allowed pretty much anything that you might have sitting. I mean, we make an M adapter for the camera, because obviously that's a direct, easy translation to that camera being very much a rangefinder type camera. And it fills in holes in the line. It fills in places where we haven't had a chance to bring a lens to market yet. I mean, and we're very much active. You said the roadmap. We're always promoting where we're going and where we're looking, and things change on that as customer demand and feedback comes back to us. We look at, well, okay, what are we missing? And what can we build that's special? How can we build lenses that are really, really unique? I mean, the 56 APD is a perfect example of that. How can we take and build a lens that has this apodization filter built into it and give you wonderful bokeh in your pictures, improve upon it even more than the standard lens has? And that gives that feature and those things. We were talking earlier back in the green room about aeroectars, on view cameras, having that look and having that feel and having some of these great things that people just love. And so, if we can produce product that fits these niches and fits that need of customer, that's what we really want to do.
So David, I mean, we're talking about big sensors in small cameras, fixed and mirrorless. I mean, from an interchangeable lens perspective, if you had to pick 3 lenses, what would they be?
Good question. I would be, what's that?
If you could only have 3.
I could only have 3, that's not going to happen. But if it did, I would be very much into having a very fast wide as possible. If it's a wide zoom, great, as long as it's fast. And I like to get close and work in low light. I need a reach of only about 200 millimeters. So I'd like a normal lens prime, specifically for me, a very fast prime. And the higher range can be a zoom, maybe 70 to 200, something like that.
That would cover 3 primes, 3 focal lengths?
3 focal lengths.
Your big 3 focal
3
lengths?
primes.
What would they be?
Okay, 16 or 17, 50 or 60 or 45, and maybe 180.
Interesting. So we're talking about cameras like this, like the LX100 from Panasonic and the RX100 from Sony. All the X's and 100s get confusing quickly. Right now, it seems like 24 millimeters is about as wide as they start at. And the zooms, for the cameras that have quite a bright aperture, the zooms are fairly restricted in reach. I mean, Matt, can you talk us through why that is? Like, what would have to change for them to be wider, faster, or longer?
Well, I think to go wider, you tend to start introducing vignetting. So the real challenge is ultimately, how do we keep the lens bright at the corners? As of right now, cost effectively, it's difficult to make a lens that's wider than 24 millimeter for an LX100 sized sensor. And I'm sure every manufacturer is going to tell you an eerily similar story with maintaining brightness. In fact, I know Sony has been working on a curved sensor to try to address some of those issues with vignetting. See, there you go. I even read some trade magazines every once in a while. So that's clearly the biggest issue we run into with going wide, is frankly keeping it bright in the corners.
And Mark, the curve sensor? You want to talk about that?
What I read in the press. What I read in the press.
So what does that allow you to do in theory? I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but let's go with it. If you did have a curved image plane, what problems would that solve? Just vignetting?
Well, I think that much has been said about how image sensors behave differently than film emulsion. Mm-hmm. And the need to get into the pixel well of a image sensor is obviously a far greater challenge than light striking a film emulsion. And the oblique angle of light as it reaches the corners of the image sensor is always a challenge. And as a primary sensor manufacturer, we've done a lot to make sure that light can get to the bottom of the photodiode, even at the corners. Obviously, many ideas have been proposed to how to improve that as sensor technology improves. Right now, what we're doing is minimizing the gap between microlenses to make sure that the microlens area above the photodiode is as large as it can be. And then the sensor that we put in the A7S has been very well received from those who are using very, very wide-angle legacy lenses, simply because the pixel size is so great.
So it's a 12-megapixel camera.
Yeah, this is a 12-megapixel camera. Each pixel is so large that it somewhat mitigates the challenge of getting light into the pixel well at the corners without any trade-off in color fringing or vignetting. So, but again, sensor technology is moving very quickly, as we all know.
I also think some of this is market demand as well.
Right.
As much as you may enjoy shooting extraordinarily wide, it's not always the case that consumers are looking for an extraordinarily wide aperture for their, wide focal length for their lens. So sometimes we have to make a decision based on what the biggest market appeal will be with the product. Realistically, one of the most popular, or at least most sought after lenses is a 24-70 f2.8 as a walkabout lens. Right, and so we want to give people a lens that is closest in relation to what they probably shoot most often. And so, aside from just wanting, just a lack of the technology to exist, I mean, clearly we could build wider angle lenses and we can do things in post-processing to brighten the corners. We could go to a 16 millimeter wide angle lens and in post brighten the corners before you ever see the file. That can certainly happen, but at what cost ultimately? What's it going to end up costing us to produce that product? How much bigger will the product ultimately have to be? And how much are we willing to sacrifice on the telephoto end? So if you're at a 20 to 50, is that really a very useful range for the average photographer, especially somebody who is probably going to be doing some portrait work with that product or want to take nice looking photos of people? 50 millimeter lens with my hairline, not very flattering in the least. So having that 75 millimeter focal length is certainly helpful.
And it sort of focuses the attention on the difference between interchangeable lens cameras and fixed lens cameras and the freedom that interchangeable lens cameras provide for photographers. They may have certain specialized lenses, certain specialized focal lengths, and the interchangeable lens camera provides them with that flexibility. But I think getting back to the point that you made earlier about how price enters into the planning process and how products are developed focused on individual customer segments, I think it really sort of goes both ways. There is certainly a lot of effort put into listening to photographers and how they use cameras and building cameras that better suit their needs. Certainly there's a whole industry involved in that for manufacturers. But on the other side of it, many of the cameras that exist today fulfill dreams that photographers, or wants, shall we say, that photographers had, but might not have known that they had. Many of the all of the cameras that you see here really are the result of the devices that are in them. They became possible because the devices were developed to do it. And device development that's a long process.
What do you mean exactly by device?
Image sensor, processor, lens, the core devices, the core building blocks that the cameras are made of. And in many cases, that can be a 2 or 3 year process. So it's quite possible that you're aiming at a target that is not fully understood by the photographic community. And I think all manufacturers are challenged with sort of leading the curve, if you will, to try to understand not necessarily how cameras are being used today, what photographers are looking for today, but what they'll be looking for in 3 years. So, I mean, when we developed the image sensor in this camera, who would have wanted a lower resolution full frame image sensor? Some, perhaps, but probably that would go against the grain. But in this case, we said, okay, fine. If we can make a 12 megapixel image sensor that can shoot, some have said it can turn night into day, and, very euphemistically, but to shoot at extraordinarily high sensitivities with extraordinary dynamic range to free your photography of the challenges of available light that, some might have said, well, yeah, that's important to me. But after actually trying it, after actually developing it and delivering it, a whole group of photographers changed the way they shoot. But again, that's just one example. There are many examples that you can see here on this table of where manufacturers took the risk and they said, you know what? It isn't necessarily true that we have people calling us on the phone every day asking for this. But we think that this is something that's going to be very important for photographers, and once they see it, they'll very much appreciate it.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, we touched on the smartphone problem earlier on, where smartphones
Opportunity.
Smartphone opportunity. Where smartphones have basically obliterated what we might call the point and shoot market. I mean, the emergence of this product class at around the same time can't be a coincidence. I mean, this is, are manufacturers attempting, big sensors are becoming a differentiator now. I mean, is that correct, do you think, Justin?
I think definitely. But I would also ask my two photographers here, when you were shooting film, if we go back, roll the clock back, how many of you carried a small, a Nikon 35 Ti, a Contax T2, one of those kind of cameras stuffed in a bag someplace that if everything went south, you had this really high quality, really small camera that could deliver really high grade professional results.
Yes.
A Rolly 35.
Rolling
Exactly.
35, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That was my go-to.
So I think there was a history and a heritage there of a camera like that. And I think the technology came mature enough to a point at about that time period to allow those cameras to emerge. I mean, that's, the X100 came out, it was Photokina 2010, was with the announcement, it was the showcase. So that time period is sort of that beginning of that nexus of changing over and, us dipping our feet in that water and other people saying, hey, there's a marketplace here. There is something here that's great to have a camera that's small, lightweight, compact, whether it's a rangefinder type camera or whether it's a compact camera. There's a need for it. There's a need to have that usage, and having that small camera that to carry with you all the time doesn't burden you.
Yes.
And that's, I always see that. I always laugh when I'm walking in New York City and I see a tourist walking around Times Square and they've got their photo backpack on and a big long zoom lens around their chest. And are you really having fun? Are you enjoying your vacation? Are you...
How's your back?
How's your back? Yeah.
I think that's more for protection.
It's more for protection.
No, I even remember that as a sports photographer, shooting with, even if your prime lenses were a 600 and a 300 at a football game, I'd always have a small body around my neck with a 35 millimeter lens just in case the touchdown happened right in front of me. It's like suddenly you just lift it up and shoot with it. So I think that's the perfect example of that smaller form factor and when it is the right situation.
So what's that camera for you now?
That camera for me now is probably this. I got the RX1 when it first came out, and I would use it for just that purpose. If I was shooting a tennis match or something, I might have a 300 and a 500, but I'd have that for the close lens. Now with the interchangeable, I'd probably put the 35-2.8 on this.
Times change.
But it's interesting because as manufacturers, we're always challenged with will it work? Will the photographers like this camera? And I remember when we were developing RX100, the first generation, and the original RX100 was $650. And the notion of a compact fixed lens camera that was $650, there were interesting points of view as to exactly what the acceptance of that would be. And there were some of us that had no hesitation, and then there were others that were a little concerned. And it's interesting because the product came to market. I think history speaks for itself as to what it did for the market, but it proved that photographers of all stripes have a passion for what they're doing, and if given a tool or a product, depending on your point of view, that allows them to do things that they hadn't done before or to behave in a way that they hadn't before, that they'll gravitate to it and it'll be successful even if it isn't the perception that they thought that something like that would cost. Because in those days, premium compact cameras were $400. If they were above $400, they were very unsuccessful. And then all of a sudden, preferences changed simply because what was not possible in the past became possible. And I think every manufacturer really is looking to offer their user base that which has not yet been made, because that is what really fires the imagination and fires the creativity of the photographers.
I'll turn to this point in a second, which is interesting, but I think we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, we sure do. Thank you. And love to hear everybody's opinion on this. We actually get this question here a lot at Creative Live, but I'm especially like to hear what Brian has to say. So as professional photographers begin to use these smaller cameras, how do they overcome clients' perception that a professional camera needs to be large?
Well, I think, and typically, like on a lot of shoots, when I first started shooting with the A7R, I would take it out with the A99, and we would hook it up, we'd tether live, and they'd be like, wait, so you mean we've got more resolution with this camera than with the bigger one? It really boils down to, I think, a lot in terms of like how you work with is what images do you come up with? It's not so much the amount of gear, it's how you use it. And I love being more discreet, using something smaller and lighter. And if I can get 36 megapixels in this versus 24 in a bigger form camera, I'm gonna go with the lighter. And I think the other thing too to look at is forget about sometimes what the clients perceive. It's like, what's the experience like for your subject? And I think as a portrait photographer, the smaller camera, I'm not suddenly holding a big box in front of my face. It's like we're shooting lighter and smaller, and it's a more intimate experience with your subject. And I think people respond to it very well because you're kind of not hidden behind a huge box.
Right. Great. Thank you.
I think there's a manufacturer perspective there, I think, as well. I mean, one of the things that we've been told over the years by manufacturers who are marketing mirrorless cameras specifically, smaller, lighter, is that it's actually quite hard to convince people that small cameras are as good as big cameras, not just clients, but people who are actually going to go out and buy them.
Yeah. And let me speak to that point, because we've done a lot of consumer research on that, because the emergence of mirrorless over the last 5 or 6 years is something that we've tracked a lot. And it's interesting, smaller and lighter is definitely an advantage, particularly to those people who have used heavier and larger cameras. But smaller and lighter by itself really is not enough to sway public opinion by and large. And what we're finding is that smaller and lighter is fine. It has to be better. It has to do something that a conventional camera design hasn't yet been able to do. And when you can combine smaller and lighter with a higher level of performance than is available with a traditional camera design, that's when the acceptance and that's when the interest level really peaks, because now it's, yes, I can have this, but I don't have to concern myself with, is it as good? Now it actually is better because it can do something that I was not able to do before.
So, Matt, you've been making mirrorless, well, Panasonic's been making mirrorless cameras now for 6 years. I mean, do you think there was a perception issue originally around like just Like they weren't as
Not
big
at
as
all.
DSLRs?
No. It was everybody just ran out and bought a G1 the second that we sent them out there, and they all thought it was as good as a full frame. Look, first off, the whole perception of camera size and quality is also fundamentally very American and European.
Right.
And in Japan, it's not really
Yeah, I was
that way
gonna
at
move
all.
on to that, yes.
So, but we're probably, I know this is going out globally. A lot of you are Americans, so we're talking to you right now. So that's a very American sort of viewpoint about photography.
Bigger is better.
And that bigger is better. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that you have to offer something that is fundamentally better, not just smaller. And so we learned that lesson very quickly with the GH1 and how we implemented video within the product. We saw a market that was really only addressed at the time by one other camera, and that was the 5D Mark II. When we launched the GH1, we put a fundamentally better functioning video form product in it with autofocus capability, a proper codec that did very good encoding for video, and that really helped to build our system. So we found a niche, and we've built upon that niche with the GH3, GH4, and so on. And that's where we really hung our hat, was providing superior video and video tools for the videographer. And we saw a hybrid photography phenomenon that was taking place where professionals are now being asked not just to provide photos, but to provide video with their photographs. And having a tool that very seamlessly can go from video to photography, it's rather difficult to do with an SLR, because the minute I move the mirror out of the way, I either have a painfully slow autofocus system or no autofocus system, depending. And then I'm having to constantly shift the mirror in and out of the way for me to be able to do my work. And you brought up an interesting point about being hidden from behind the camera. Well, with video production, we always want to be looking at our subject over the camera, not hidden behind it. So if we're trying to gain engagement with somebody, to get better, more natural reactions, it's nice to be able to shoot live view and have the camera on a tripod so I can interact with that person and make them feel more at ease. And so these are the things that we really focused heavily on.
So, sorry, David.
I just want to speak to what came in from the audience. Additionally, I start my workshop that's called Creative Photography with Any Camera. It's specifically for people who may not have an SLR system. And the first thing I do is I show them a group of images and I say, which camera shot this, the full-size SLR or this guy? They never get it right. And so I dissolve the perception by saying, you know, the quality in the small cameras may also give you a lot of freedom when you take photographs. There are places I use a small camera where I wouldn't put my head in a 35, and I'll still get the shot. So I think it's changing.
Confidence?
It's the confidence in the photographer and the work that they're doing. If you have a level of confidence that you're going to get the best possible results from the tool that you choose to use, you're going to exude that confidence for the client. And so, you know, if it gives you more confidence to shoot behind an SLR with a pentaprism and a mirror element, then shoot SLR. Feel free to. If that's what it takes to make you confident in front of your client, by all means do so. But if you're very confident in your work and you know you're going to get fantastic results, you really have nothing to apologize for as to what equipment you're using.
So in terms of perception, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, Justin, but it seems to me that Fujifilm went a slightly different route with the X series. Rather than introducing a feature that no one ever had before, you went very specific styling. You know, you made cameras that were aesthetically quite distinct. I mean, do you think that's correct?
I think that's a very correct assumption. I mean, we've focused a bit more with controls and delivering that as a primary function and sort of that classic photographic experience. And I think, I mean, since the American public, you know, we're not known necessarily so much for cameras in America. We have a long history and long heritage of making cameras, you know, that mostly professional cameras, 645, 680s, medium format cameras for many, many years. We weren't as well known with our partnerships that we were producing cameras for other people. And so I think we look at what's important and how do we fit these needs. And, you know, sort of always get asked questions about retro styling and how we're doing things and what we're doing. And, you know, the lineage of this camera goes back to an old 35 millimeter compact camera that we made back in the 60s. And, you know, the styling of the XT1 based off of an early Fujica SLR camera that, you know, I'd never seen of in the US before, and they pulled one out and, you know, it looks very much similar to it. So it's just a question of what the needs are. But I think, technologically though, also, I think the EVF has changed. I think that's that key technology that's allowed the mirrorless cameras to really make this next leap forward. When the EVF first started coming out and some of the mirrorless cameras first came out, the EVF was laggy. It was kind of like, you move the camera and, oh, wait a minute, now the picture caught up to me. And the technology, the refresh rates, the speed of the processors, the speed of the cameras has allowed that to sort of disappear. And that EVF gives us a lot of flexibility.
So it's another thing to remove the impression of compromise from these small, big sensor products. I mean, let's talk about, to pick back up the behavioral changes in the marketplace that came before the break. You're looking at a huge number of photographers now, more than ever before, because they're using smartphones. A lot of people who have a smartphone as their primary or only camera. How much of a lot of people not criticize, a lot of people were somewhat cynical around the X100 when it first came out, the first X series product, that it was deliberately appealing to hipsters. It was hipster styled. How would you read, this is a historical criticism, but was that deliberate? Were you trying to appeal to the Instagram crowd?
I don't think we necessarily were trying to appeal to the Instagram crowd. I think we were looking at wanting to integrate that optical finder and looking at that as a piece and seeing a marketplace where there was a need. Inside optical, there's two camera manufacturers that make cameras with optical finders. And one of them is very expensive and one of them is us. So to have that feature, there's advantages to an optical finder. There's the way you see the world, seeing the world in focus and not seeing lens vision. It's an interesting way to photograph. It's the way I love to photograph because it allows me to see the depth of a scene. You think more spatially in a composition because you're not being forced to look at, okay, well, there's my subject, it's in focus at f2.8, my background's fuzzy, it's a different way of seeing. Also seeing what's in your frame and what's outside of your frame speaks to a different kind of photography and a history of photography, of street photography, of documentary photography, of journalism. So it's a little bit different of a piece. And I think that camera, we have a lot of history and a lot of heritage. The first production lenses that Fujifilm actually made and sold were actually lenses for Leicas.
Right.
Right after World War II, right in the late 1940s.
We're talking about travel lightweight cameras. The best camera you have is the best camera you have on you. I mean, Matt and Mark, Panasonic and Sony, you've actually gotten into the smartphone market. A lot of people
and then you drank back out.
Right.
Right back out of that
is
pool
the one
very
in the
quickly.
smartphone. I mean, Matt, you've got the CM1 here, which was announced at Photokina.
Yes.
Which I know is limited release. It's only Germany and France, I think, for now.
Correct, Germany and France. I think before we get to this, you have three manufacturers here who are doing one thing important, and that is innovating, not saying, oh, woe is me, the smartphone is killing our business. If we could just educate people on why they need to transition back to a camera, then we would save our business. The truth is that if we all stick our heads in the sand and just assume by educating people that they're going to stop using their smartphones and go back.
They'll fix your problems for you.
Right, that's just, it's ridiculous and pointless. So I think all three companies would rather innovate and give people genuine reasons to improve their photo experience. A product like a CM1, which uses a 1-inch sensor, which is massive for a smartphone, and a really nice Leica 27mm equivalent focal length lens, provides somebody with an experience that's very close to what you're going to get from a modern point-and-shoot camera in terms of photo quality. Most importantly, dynamic range. I think that's the thing that bothers me about smartphone photography. It's not necessarily the noise, it's the total lack of dynamic range, and everybody's a silhouette anymore because they can't get anything exposed correctly. So by giving somebody a sensor that can give you some reasonable dynamic range, and obviously resolution is great, we feel that this is a market opportunity that hasn't been addressed by providing a really high-grade camera in a smartphone. Clearly, it doesn't address every possible need, whether that's zoom, which clearly an LX100 is going to be better suited for, or a LX7 for that matter is going to be better suited for. But at least we're now giving somebody an exposure to what's possible with a better camera in their smartphone.
So we live in a world now where, to keep on the topic of smartphones for a minute as we move into the final few minutes, we live in a world now where the smartphone is a lot of people's first camera, primary camera. how do you persuade them to, this question for you, Mark, how do you persuade them to upgrade their camera by buying something like an RX 100? I mean, how do you send that message?
Well, part of it is what the camera does for them. It has to excite their interest. It has to be something that they want to adopt. But at this, it has to have an appeal to it, not only in terms of performance and what it will do for their pictures, but it has to be something that, there has to be a pride of ownership. Certainly if you look at the way many phones are purchased, people are not only trading in their phones to get the latest phone, they're also going after the most expensive phone because it's such a part of their life. So a camera has to have that sort of appeal as well. But the other part of it is the functionality. We're finding that a lot of the gravitation to using a phone as a camera is, part of it is, well, a lot of it is because it's always with you.
It's easy.
Yeah, it's easy. But a lot of it is the seamless way in which they can use imaging as communication. In many cases, they're not taking a picture the way a photographer would take a picture for a posterity or things like that. They're using it as a form of visual communication, right? And cameras can behave that way as well. It's just that they haven't typically been thought of that way. So if the camera, particularly a camera that very much appeals to them and is very easy for them to carry and use, if it can fulfill that role, if it can behave in that way, if they can capture images and share them as quickly as they want to for the purpose of visual communication, then that takes down an obstacle. We think that that's important as well. So convincing them that, well, you need to use this device because this will give you better pictures, that's part of the process.
But it has to be a desirable object.
And it has to fit into their workflow.
Yeah, right.
If it can accomplish that, then, and I think manufacturers are working in that direction. We are as well. We have a feature now with our iOS and Android app for smart devices that allows you to upload without having to do it manually, for instance. It becomes an automatic function. So if it can fit into their workflow, if it can fit into their habit, we think that that's a big, big step.
And from your perspective, I guess all the manufacturers, you know, the bigger the sensor, the better the image quality of the product, the better.
Yeah, it has
as far
to
as
be
differentiation is concerned.
It has to deliver the compelling results that help them understand that yes, it really is worth it. Many of the pictures that they're taking really do deserve to be taken with a camera.
So let's talk about, we're finishing up now. We've been talking about large sensors and increasingly small cameras with the two photographers here, Brian and David. I mean, David, I'll ask the same question to both of you. I'll start with you, David. If you had to, in your head, just design the perfect camera for you for what you do as a travel photographer, what would it be? How would it look?
It would be something that fits nicely in my hand, that doesn't block my face when I'm facing people. It doesn't separate me from my subject. It would be something that responds immediately to my whim, make the exposure. It would be weather resistant to some extent. It would have a full series of lenses available to it, or something magical within it that could quite do that similarly. The social thing is very important, I think. One of the things I currently miss on my full-frame SLR is the ability to immediately use that photograph.
So connectivity.
And to say, here I am doing this, share it with me. And so I would love to be able to speak into the back of that camera to do something like Siri, where it types out what I want, which incidentally an early Fuji did for me very beautifully. I could record something about my image. So I'm annotating the image and then upload it. That would be fantastic.
Brian?
Yeah.
I think to me it's really image quality. This is, the smaller form factor is a great bonus, but I'm really looking for features that I couldn't get elsewhere. So having the high resolution in a very small package just makes it, at the end of the day, I don't feel like I've gone 15 rounds with Mike Tyson, because it's like sometimes I've done portrait shoots where we shoot as many as 30 celebrities in a day during Oscars or something, and at the end of the day you feel really good but really beat up. Yeah. And I love now that at the end of the day I'm excited and feel good. So I think as you're shooting you don't notice it, but more and more the photographers of my generation are looking for something lighter and smaller that gives them as much image quality as they've always expected, or in some cases, like the A7R, more.